The coffee was still swirling in my favourite blue mug when I noticed Richard had set out 2-place settings instead of 3, and I hadn't told him yet that Karen cancelled. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching him move between the counter and the table, his slippers scuffing the tile in that unhurried shuffle I'd memorized across 41 years of Sunday mornings. He placed the butter dish at the center, adjusted a fork, stepped back to inspect his work the way he always did, like breakfast was a small project he could get exactly right. 2-place settings, 2 glasses of orange juice, the third chair pushed slightly back from the table as if someone had already risen from it and left. "Karen called," I said. He didn't startle, he just picked up the creamer and poured, his hand steady. I figured. Something about the way he said it, not disappointed, not surprised, just resigned, the way you'd acknowledge weather, planted a seed of unease beneath my ribs. I set it aside. I was good at setting things aside. 41 years of marriage had given me a black belt in it. Our house sat on 1/3 of an acre in Mapleton, the kind of property people described with words like charming and original, which really meant small and old. But I loved it the way you love a body you've lived in long enough to forgive. The porch leaned slightly west. The kitchen window framed a Japanese maple Richard had planted when Sarah was born, its branches now wide enough to shade the entire yard. I knew every crack in those walls, every draft that crept under the back door in February. The house held our noise and our silence equally, and I never once thought of it as something that needed to be solved. We ate quietly, toast, scrambled eggs with chives from the garden. Richard read the sports section and I read nothing at all, just sat with the light coming through the maple in that green underwater way that made the whole room feel like the inside of a held breath. I was content. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, deeply content. Karen called back around 11. She and the kids would come for dinner after all. Tommy had a half day of something and Sarah wanted to show me a drawing. I said wonderful because it was. I pulled a roast from the freezer and began to plan. Richard went quiet in the way that was different from his usual quiet. He sat in his recliner with the newspaper folded on his lap, not reading, just pressing his thumb against the arm of the chair in slow circles. I almost crossed the room and put my hand over his and said, "What is it?" But the roast needed seasoning and the dining room table needed its leaf put in, and I told myself I'd ask later. I wish I'd asked then. Karen arrived at 4 with the children and a bottle of wine I knew she'd picked because the label looked expensive, not because she'd tasted it. She had a way of walking into our home like she was already measuring the walls. I used to think that was confidence. I used to admire it. Tommy ran straight for the backyard, screen door banging behind him, and Sarah pressed herself against my legs with a sheet of construction paper held up like a flag. A house with a purple roof. Our house, she said, with a garden. I told her it was beautiful, and I meant it so completely that my chest ached in a way I didn't understand yet. Richard took the wine and thanked Karen and said something about the drive, and Karen said the traffic wasn't bad, and they performed their little routine of pleasantries the way 2 people do when they've agreed without saying so that the surface is all they'll tend to. I watched from the kitchen doorway, drying my hands on a towel, and I noticed how Karen touched Richard's elbow, briefly steering, and how he let himself be steered. Dinner was fine for 20 minutes. The roast came out better than I'd hoped. Tommy ate his carrots without negotiation, which felt like a small miracle. Richard carved, and I passed plates, and Karen talked about her promotion and a conference in Austin and the new curriculum at Tommy's school, and all of it flowed the way river water flows over rocks, smooth on top, working hard underneath. Then she said it. She'd been cutting her meat into precise squares, the way she did everything, and without looking up, she mentioned that she'd spoken with a realtor, a friend of a friend, she said, just to get a sense of the market, just to understand what options might look like down the road, for when Richard and I were ready to think about something smaller, something manageable. She said the word manageable the way a doctor says comfortable when they mean something else entirely. I set my fork down. I looked at Richard. His face had gone the color of January. Not surprised. That was the thing that caught in my throat like a bone. Not surprised. Stricken, yes. Guilty, absolutely. But not surprised. He'd heard this before. She had pitched this to him already, maybe more than once, in phone calls I wasn't part of, in conversations held in the gaps of our life where I assumed nothing important was happening. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table the same way he'd pressed it against the arm of his recliner, those slow circles, and I understood now what that gesture meant. It meant he was holding something down. Karen kept talking. Square footage and equity and the phrase unlock the value, as if our home were a puzzle box with money trapped inside, rather than 40 years of a life I had built with my hands and my patience and my heart. I smiled. I said that was very thoughtful of her. I said we weren't in any rush, and under the table I pressed my own hands flat against my knees to keep them from shaking. Karen offered to help with the dishes, which she had never done before, and I should have understood right then that the offer was not generosity but positioning. She wanted to stand in my kitchen. She wanted to open my cabinets and touch my things and let the familiarity settle over her like a claim. I told her I'd managed just fine. I always had. She laughed at that, a light little sound she'd perfected over the years, the kind of laugh designed to make you feel like you'd said something quaint rather than something true. Then she excused herself to use the restroom, and Richard followed Tommy and Sarah into the living room where the television was already murmuring about football. And for a moment I stood alone in the kitchen I had painted 3 times, where I had taught Richard to make his mother's pot roast, where I had pressed my forehead against the cold window above the sink on the night we lost the baby we never talked about. I ran the water hot. I let the steam curl up past my wrist. I washed each plate with the same deliberate care I'd been giving things my whole life. Thorough, unhurried, certain that attention was its own kind of prayer. The casserole dish needed soaking, so I set it aside and reached for the serving platter, and that's when I noticed Karen's phone on the counter. She must have set it down when she carried in the salad bowl, tucked just behind the paper towel holder where it blended into the clutter of a meal being cleaned up. I was not the kind of woman who looked at other people's phones. I want to be clear about that. I had never read Richard's messages, never checked Sarah's diary when she was a teenager, never opened mail that wasn't addressed to me. Privacy was something I believed in the way some people believed in God, quietly, totally, without needing anyone else to agree. But the screen lit up on its own. The name at the top said Denise, and I did not know a Denise. Karen had never mentioned a Denise. In 23 years of holidays and birthday calls and careful Sunday dinners, not once had that name crossed the table. I set the platter down. I dried my hands on the towel that hung from the oven handle, the one embroidered with small lemons that Richard had bought me from a craft fair because he said it looked cheerful and our kitchen could use more cheer. I read the message. I read it twice because the first time my mind refused to hold it. The way your palm refuses to hold a coal. 4 words glowing on that screen, sitting in my kitchen, next to my dish soap and my lemon towel. Did they sign yet? Karen slid a single sheet of paper across the kitchen table, and the number at the bottom had a $sign in front of it. 2000 typed in bold like an invoice for plumbing work. I didn't pick it up right away. I remember that. I remember staring at it the way you'd stare at something dead on the road, something you weren't sure had been alive a moment ago. The paper was crisp, white, laser printed. She'd used a template. I could see the faint grid lines of a spreadsheet, the neat columns, the tiny font along the margins that said asterisk page 1 of 1 asterisk, as if there might have been more, as if this document had been edited down, distilled, refined to its cleanest possible cruelty. Tommy was in the next room. I could hear him talking to his action figures, giving them little voices, a deep one for the hero and a squeaky one for the villain. He was 5. He didn't know that on the other side of the wall his grandmother was being handed a price tag for the privilege of hearing those voices. The kitchen smelled like the lemon cleaner Karen used on everything. She kept a spotless house. I'll give her that. I always gave her that. The countertops gleamed. The dish towels hung in perfect parallel from the oven handle. There was a system to this home, a machinery, and I had just been fed into it. I looked at Richard. He sat at the end of the table with his hands folded, thumbs circling each other in slow rotation, the way he used to do before parent-teacher conferences when he knew his grades weren't good. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He studied the wood grain of the table like it held some answer he was still working out, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but tilt, the way a picture frame tilts on a nail that's coming loose from the wall. Karen watched me. She had her reading glasses pushed up on top of her head and her arms crossed, and she wore the expression of someone who had prepared for a difficult meeting and was now executing it on schedule. There was no malice in her face. That was the part that unsettled me most. She looked patient. She looked like a woman waiting for a slow computer to load. "Take your time reading through it," she said. "I want you to see that it's fair." Fair. The word landed on the table between us like a coin tossed into a well. I picked up the paper then, finally, because my hands needed something to do other than tremble in my lap. The header read asterisk monthly visitation arrangement, terms and compensation. Below that, in italics, asterisk effective immediately. My eyes moved down the page. Line items, neat, numbered, categorized. Each one carried a dollar amount to its right, and each one described some fragment of my grandson's life as though it were a billable service. I read the first 3 entries and felt the floor beneath my chair grow soft, uncertain, like standing on a dock that had started to drift from shore. Richard's thumbs kept circling. He still hadn't spoken, and somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part that mothers keep locked away until the evidence becomes undeniable, I understood that his silence wasn't confusion, it was compliance. He'd seen this document before. Karen took the paper back gently, the way someone retrieves a contract they expected to be signed, and tapped the 4th line with a fingernail painted the colour of dried blood. "This one's the supervisory hours," she said. $20 an hour. That covers the time I spend physically present while Tommy is with you. Because I can't just drop him off, Margaret. I have to manage his transitions. I have to prepare him emotionally for the visit and then decompress with him afterward. That's labour. Uncompensated labour historically. She said the word asterisk, historically asterisk, as though we had centuries of grievance between us, rather than 4 Thanksgivings and a handful of strained birthday parties. I watched her mouth form each syllable with the precision of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror, or maybe in front of my son, polishing this little performance until every angle caught the light she wanted. I looked down at the sheet again. Line 5, asterisk meal preparation and dietary oversight, $150/month. Asterisk line 6, asterisk transportation and vehicle wear, calculated at the federal mileage rate. Asterisk line 7, and this was the one that made something small and bright crack behind my sternum. Line 7 read asterisk emotional coordination fee, $400/month. Asterisk as if love were a logistical problem that required a project manager. Karen, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised us both. I've been seeing Tommy every other Saturday for 3 years. I bring lunch. I drive to you. I've never once asked you to do anything except open the door. She smiled at that. Not a cruel smile exactly, but the patient, tilted smile of someone who believes they are educating you. That's exactly the issue, she said. You don't see the invisible labour. You show up, you have your fun afternoon, and then I'm left handling the emotional fallout. Tommy gets overstimulated. He asks questions about why Grandma doesn't live with us. I have to manage all of that. Alone. She looked at Richard when she said asterisk alone. Asterisk, and something passed between them. A signal, a cue, the kind of silent choreography that belongs to couples who have rehearsed their arguments until the arguments become scripture. Richard cleared his throat. He shifted forward in his chair, and I turned to him with everything I had left. Every molecule of the woman who had rocked him through fevers and driven him to baseball and sat in the hallway outside his bedroom door the night his father left, just sat there so he'd know someone was close. I turned to him and I waited. I gave him the silence a mother gives when she already knows the answer but needs to hear her child say it out loud, needs the wound to come from his voice specifically so she can understand its exact shape. His thumbs stopped circling. He placed both hands flat on the table. "Mom," he said, and the word came out steady, practiced, like something he'd said into a bathroom mirror that morning until it stopped trembling. She's actually being generous. I felt the sentence land somewhere beneath my sternum, not like a blow, but like a needle, thin, precise, finding the exact space between ribs where there was no bone to protect anything. The kitchen didn't spin, the lights didn't flicker. Nothing dramatic happened at all, which was the cruelest part because the world just kept being ordinary while something inside me came quietly unseamed. The first number was higher, he added. Karen leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, and I caught the smallest movement at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that, the kind of micro-expression a person makes when a negotiation lands exactly where they'd planned it. She'd anchored high. She'd let Richard deliver the concession. I was supposed to feel grateful now. I was supposed to look at $2,000 a month and think, asterisk well, at least it's not 3. I kept my eyes on my son. I searched his face the way you search a house you used to live in, looking for the door frames you marked his height against, looking for the scuff on the baseboard from the tricycle, looking for any residue of the life that had happened there before someone else moved in and painted over everything. His jaw was set, his eyes were focused on a spot just left of my shoulder. He couldn't look at me directly, and I understood then that this was the one honest thing he'd done all evening. That small avoidance, that centimetre of cowardice, because somewhere behind the rehearsed lines and the flat palms on the table, some surviving fragment of my boy knew exactly what he was doing to his mother. I wanted to say something large. I wanted to stand up and make the kind of speech that rearranges a room, that cracks open a son's chest and shows him his own heart and shames him back into it. But my throat had gone tight and dry, and the words I found there were small, practical, ordinary, because grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits in a kitchen chair and blinks. For Tommy, I said. You're charging me to see Tommy. Karen unfolded her arms and tapped the paper with one manicured fingernail. We're establishing boundaries, Margaret, healthy ones. You should actually be thanking us. Richard nodded. My son, the boy I'd held against my chest in a hospital hallway while his father's taillights disappeared down Macon Street. The boy I'd fed with grocery money I didn't have. The boy whose name I whispered into the dark every single night, like a prayer I was terrified God would stop answering. My son nodded, and I reached for my purse. The envelope felt like it weighed more than my whole body. $600 in 20s, counted out 3 times on my kitchen table at 5 in the morning. I'd pulled each bill from the ATM the day before, 2 transactions because the machine wouldn't let me take more than 300 at once. Standing there in the fluorescent hum of the bank vestibule, I'd shielded the screen with my body like someone might be watching. Nobody was. Nobody cared about a 62-year-old woman draining her savings account in increments. But shame has its own logic, and mine told me to hunch and hide. $600. That was what Karen had decided Tommy was worth. Not what Tommy was worth. I knew better than that. But what my access to him cost. She'd named the figure so casually during that phone call, the way a person might quote the price of getting a tire rotated. Something routine, something deserved, and I'd agreed to it because the alternative was a silence I couldn't survive. I sealed the envelope and wrote Karen's name on the front in my steadiest handwriting. My fingers wanted to tremble, but I wouldn't let them. I'd already cancelled the appointment with Dr. Ellison, the follow-up for my knee that I'd waited 3 months to get. $40 copay saved. I'd switched from the name-brand blood pressure medication to the generic, which the pharmacist warned might not agree with me as well. Another $22 a month. I'd stopped buying the good coffee, the one small luxury I allowed myself every morning, the dark roast from the place on Buchanan Street that smelled like someone was roasting the beans right there behind the counter. Now I drank whatever was on sale at the grocery store, and it tasted like paper and regret. These were small surrenders. I told myself that. Small prices for the sound of Tommy's laughter, for the chance to sit beside him on the carpet and build whatever he wanted to build out of those mismatched Legos he loved. He was 5. He wouldn't be 5 much longer. Children don't wait for the adults in their lives to sort things out. Sarah called that evening while I was tucking the envelope into my purse for the morning drop-off. I let the phone ring twice to steady my breath. "How are you doing, Mum?" she asked, and I could hear the particular care she threaded through the question. My daughter worried about me. She'd been worrying more since Richard passed, watching me the way you watch a house that's settled unevenly on its foundation. Not broken yet, but listing. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just had a quiet day." The lie came out smooth and whole, no seams. I'd never been a dishonest person. 40 years of marriage to Richard and I could count on one hand the things I'd hidden from him. But this, the money, the arrangement, the slow excavation of my dignity, this was something I folded up and placed in a room inside myself that Sarah didn't have the key to. She would have tried to stop me. She would have been right to try, but I couldn't stop myself. Tommy was on the other side of that money, and every dollar I surrendered was a brick in the bridge back to him. That's what I told myself while I cancelled the supplemental insurance on my teeth. That's what I whispered into the dark bedroom ceiling at 2 a.m. when the numbers wouldn't quit circling. 600 this month, 600 next month. A grandmother's pension has edges, and I was already pressing against them. I stopped buying the good coffee, the dark roast from the place on Maple that Richard and I used to walk to on Sunday mornings. I switched to the store brand that came in a tin so light it felt like holding an apology. I let the subscription to the garden magazine lapse. I told myself I'd memorize what I already knew about roses, that I didn't need new pictures of somebody else's yard to feel alive. Small surrenders, the kind nobody notices unless they're the one making them. The second envelope went out in October. I drove to Karen's apartment complex and left it in the mailbox because she'd told me not to come to the door. Tommy's in a routine, she'd said. I don't want to disrupt his afternoon. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes afterward, engine running, watching the window on the second floor where I thought his room might be. A cartoon flickered blue against the curtain. I wanted so badly for that to be him, cross-legged on the carpet, laughing at something silly the way 5-year-olds do, open-mouthed with their whole bodies. I drove home and ate toast for dinner. It was Richard's old friend, Dennis, who broke the spell. Dennis, who still came by once a month to check on the gutters and drink decaf on the porch. He didn't mean to do it. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd run into Karen at the pharmacy, said she'd been chatty, said she'd told him how generous I was, sending money for Tommy every month, and how sad it was that I'd chosen not to visit. I set my cup down carefully, the way you handle something when your hands have gone untrustworthy. She said that, I repeated. Not a question. Dennis nodded, oblivious. Said you told her you felt too guilty about Richard to be around the boy. That the money was your way of, what was the word she used? Atoning. The porch tilted. Not literally, but something in the architecture of what I'd understood shifted hard to the left, and I could feel every beam straining. Karen hadn't just taken my money, she'd taken the story. She'd rewritten me, turned me into a woman so broken by grief that she'd abandoned her own grandson and tried to buy forgiveness with 20s in an envelope. And Tommy was living inside that lie, breathing it, believing it. I thanked Dennis. I smiled. I waited until his truck pulled out of the driveway and the sound of his engine dissolved into the ordinary noise of the street. Then I went inside and picked up the phone. My hands were steady. That was the strangest part. Through every envelope I'd counted, every coupon I'd clipped, every lie I'd swallowed with my morning coffee, my hands had trembled. But now they were calm in a way that felt borrowed from someone braver than me. I punched in the numbers from memory. Karen's number, the one I'd dialed so many times it lived in my fingers the way old hymns live in the throat. The line rang once. Twice, I could hear my own breathing reflected back at me in the silence between rings, and I used that silence to build the sentence I'd been constructing since Dennis's truck disappeared. I would say her name. I would say I knew. I would tell her that the payments were finished, that the story she'd sewn around my grandson was coming apart at every seam, and that whatever she thought she'd built on top of my grief would not hold. 3 rings, 4, a click, a breath, and then not Karen. The voice was higher, thinner, shaped like a question before it even formed one. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat when it wakes you in the dark. I'd rocked that voice to sleep 1,000 nights. I'd read to it, sang to it, pressed my lips against the warm skull it came from when it was new to the world and Richard was still alive to cry at the sight of his grandson's fingers. "Hello?" Tommy said. I opened my mouth and nothing came. Every careful sentence I'd stacked collapsed. 6 months of rehearsed strength gone. Because this wasn't Karen on the other end. This was the reason I'd emptied my savings. The reason I ate store-brand everything and let the dentist appointment slide and told Sarah the thermostat was broken instead of admitting I kept the heat at 58 to save $11 a month. This voice was the entire architecture of my sacrifice. And it was right there, close enough to touch if phones worked the way hearts wanted them to. "Tommy," I managed, "it's grammar. A pause. The kind of pause that doesn't belong in a child's mouth. The kind that gets taught." "Oh," he said, "small. Careful." And then, with the particular cruelty that only borrowed words carry, words placed in a boy's mouth by someone who understood exactly what they would do to the woman hearing them, he said the thing that opened me from sternum to spine. "Grandma, why don't you love me anymore?" I gripped the edge of the counter, the kitchen light buzzed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked at nothing, and my steady hands, those brave borrowed hands, finally shook. He was 8 years old, and he believed it. The Thanksgiving group text went silent for 11 minutes after I asked what time I should arrive, and when it reappeared, the thread had been renamed without my name in it. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched every one of them tick past on the microwave clock while I stood in my kitchen holding a bag of cranberries I'd already bought. Fresh ones, not canned, because Tommy had told me once that he liked the way they popped between his teeth, and I'd driven to 3 stores to find the kind that still had stems. 11 minutes. Long enough for a conversation I wasn't part of. Long enough for someone to rearrange a guest list the way you rearrange furniture, quietly, while the person who used to sit there is in another room. The original thread had been called Thanksgiving Plans Everybody, which Richard had named because he still typed like a man who discovered exclamation points late in life and couldn't stop using them. The new thread was called Turkey Day 2024, clean, generic, and when I scrolled back to check, I found the old thread archived, my last message sitting at the bottom of it like a letter returned to sender. Asterisk, what time should I come? I'm bringing cranberry sauce and that corn casserole Sarah liked last year. No reply, no read receipt, just the quiet hum of a door I hadn't heard close. I set the cranberries on the counter and told myself it was a glitch. Group texts did strange things sometimes. Threads split, names dropped, messages wandered into digital nowhere. I was 62 years old and I'd learnt long ago that technology could make a person feel insane if she let it. So I didn't let it. I poured myself a glass of water. I wiped down the counter that was already clean. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the corn casserole ingredients I'd lined up on the second shelf, like little soldiers waiting for their orders, and I closed the door gently, the way you close something when you're not yet ready to admit it might not need opening again. But the thread stayed renamed, and no one added me back. By evening, I'd composed and deleted 4 different messages to Richard. The first was casual. Asterisk, hey, think I got dropped from the new thread. Can you add me? The second was more direct. The third was something closer to honest. The fourth I don't remember because I erased it so fast my thumb ached, and I sat there on the edge of my bed with the phone screen dimming against my palm, aware of a weight settling across my shoulders that had nothing to do with tired muscles. I'd felt this weight before, in small doses. A Sunday visit cut from 4 hours to 2. A birthday party where my chair had been placed at the far end of the table, near the door, as if I might need to leave early. Tiny subtractions, each one barely worth mentioning on its own, each one ordinary enough to make me feel foolish for noticing. But I noticed the group text was the first thing that truly cut. It had started in early October. Sarah had created it, named it *Mom and Fam Turkey Plans*, and for a few weeks we'd exchanged the usual back and forth about side dishes and arrival times and whether Tommy was old enough this year to try a sliver of pecan pie. Ordinary negotiations. The kind of small logistical chatter that holds a family together like mortar between bricks. Then I asked my question on a Tuesday evening. What time should I come? Simple as breathing, and the thread went quiet. Not the quiet of people busy with their evenings. A different quiet, the kind that hums. 11 minutes later, a new message appeared, but the thread name had changed. It now read *Fam Turkey Plans*. My name sounded off like a blemish on furniture, and the message wasn't a reply to me at all. It was Karen, asking Richard whether they should do the cornbread stuffing or the sausage one, as if the last 11 minutes hadn't happened, as if I hadn't spoken. I told myself it was a glitch. I told myself Sarah had probably just shortened the name. I told myself several things I didn't believe, and then I called Richard. He answered on the 5th ring, which was unusual. My son had always been a second ring person, eager, a little breathless, the way he'd been as a boy racing to the kitchen phone. 5 rings meant deliberation. 5 rings meant someone else's hand hovering near his, telling him to wait. "Hey, Mum." His voice carried a flatness I recognized from every school play he'd performed in, the stiff cadence of memorized lines. "So we've been talking, and this year we think it might be best to keep Thanksgiving small. Just our household. Karen's been overwhelmed with work and the kids' schedules, and we really need a low-key holiday to recharge as a unit." As a unit. Richard had never used that phrase in his life. I opened my mouth to respond, and that's when I heard it, a whisper just beneath his words, thin as thread but unmistakable. Karen's voice feeding him the next sentence the way a prompter feeds lines from the wings. "It's nothing personal," he continued, and behind him, barely a breath's width from the microphone, came the correction, "It's not about you, *" and Richard repeated it half a beat later, smoothing it into his own mouth, as if it had been his thought all along. "It's not about you, Mom. We just need space." I sat very still and listened to my son speak in a voice that wasn't his, reciting words chosen by a woman who'd learned that the surest way to remove me wasn't a locked door, but a script. A careful, reasonable script, designed to make me feel unreasonable for questioning it. I didn't question it. I said, "All right, sweetheart," and hung up before my voice could betray what my hands were already doing, shaking against the kitchen counter like something had come loose inside the machinery of me. Thanksgiving morning tasted like iron. I'd woken with that flavor on my tongue, as though I'd bitten through something in my sleep. A word, maybe, or the last filament of pretending that the silence was temporary. I cooked anyway. Not a whole turkey. I wasn't delusional, but a small breast roast, mashed potatoes with the skins left in the way Richard had always liked, cranberry sauce from scratch because I'd never once opened a can and I wasn't about to let that woman take my rituals along with everything else. I set one plate on the table, one glass, one fork. I even folded the napkin, tucked it under the edge of the plate the way my mother had taught me, because dignity was a muscle and I intended to use it even when no one was watching. The house was so quiet I could hear the ice maker cycle in the freezer. 2 clicks, a low hum, a shudder of release. I counted 4 cycles before I sat down to eat. That was almost an hour of standing in my own kitchen, with nowhere to put my hands, nowhere to direct the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being erased slowly, methodically, by someone who smiles while they do it. I ate. The food was good. That's the part no one tells you about grief. It doesn't ruin your cooking. The potatoes were perfect, and the cranberries had that tart snap that Sarah used to say made her whole face wake up. Sarah, who hadn't texted me in 9 days. Sarah, who was 12 and already learning that grandmothers could be optional. I washed the single plate, the single glass, the single fork. I dried them and put them away. I wiped the counter until it shone, and then I sat in the chair by the window where the afternoon light fell in a long gold stripe across the floor, and I let the weariness settle into my bones like sediment finding the bottom of a river. My phone had been face down on the counter all day. I'd put it there deliberately, the way you put a knife in a drawer. Not because you've forgotten what it can do, but precisely because you haven't. At 4:17 it lit up. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that even as I reached for it, knew it the way you know a stove is hot before your skin confirms it. But loneliness has its own gravity, and I'd been falling all day. Karen had posted a photo. My dining room chairs, the ones I'd given Richard when he bought the house, were crowded around her table. Sarah was laughing, and there was Tommy, 3 years old and luminous in the cable-knit sweater I'd mailed him 2 weeks ago, perched in Richard's lap like a small king. The caption read, "Thankful for our whole family." She'd dressed my grandson in my love and called it hers. My collarbone had become a shelf. I noticed it one morning while dressing, the way the bone jutted out like something trying to escape from under a tarp. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and traced it with my finger, this ridge that hadn't been visible since my 20s, back when I lived on coffee and optimism and Richard's promises. The skin over it looked thin as tracing paper. I pulled my blouse on quickly, buttoned it to the throat, and decided the mirror and I had nothing left to say to each other. I had become skilled at the geometry of concealment. Layers in summer, cardigans draped just so. I kept my sleeves long because my wrists had begun to look fragile in a way that invited questions, and questions were a currency I could not afford. Not the emotional cost of answering them, and not the practical cost of whatever answers might set into motion. I had spent 37 years building a life that looked, from the outside, like a house someone loved. I could spend a few more months making sure nobody peered through the windows. Sarah called on a Tuesday. She always called on Tuesdays, punctual as a church bell, and I had learned to time my voice accordingly, bright enough to sound like myself, measured enough that she wouldn't hear the hollow underneath. I told her about the magnolia in the front yard, how it was budding early this year. I told her Tommy had sent me a drawing from school, a crayon sun with legs. I did not tell her that I'd taped Tommy's drawing to the kitchen wall because the kitchen had become so empty that even a child's scribble made it feel less like a room where someone had given up. She said she was coming by Saturday, just to visit, she said, in that careful way she had of making things sound casual when they weren't. Sarah had inherited my observance, but not my patience with silence. She watched people the way a nurse watches a patient's breathing, automatically, relentlessly, cataloguing every irregularity for later. I spent the days before her visit in a kind of quiet panic. I moved the cereal box from the nightstand back to the pantry, then realized the pantry's emptiness would only amplify it, a single box of store-brand bran flakes standing like a monument to what wasn't there. I moved it back. I wiped the kitchen counters until they gleamed, as though cleanliness could substitute for abundance. I rehearsed explanations in my head. I've been simplifying, I've been decluttering, I've been meaning to go to the store, each one a small polished stone I could place in her hand to weigh against what her eyes would tell her. Saturday morning arrived the way all dreaded things do, disguised as ordinary light through ordinary curtains. I heard her car pull into the driveway, heard the engine cut, heard the pause before her door opened, that half second where Sarah always sat collecting herself, gathering whatever version of cheerful she'd decided to wear. I opened the front door before she could knock, the way I always had, and watched her face perform its routine. The bright smile, the slight tilt of her head, the arms already reaching. But I saw the exact moment the smile caught on something. Her eyes moved across my face, down my neck, lingered at the collarbone I hadn't been able to disguise beneath the cardigan, despite the July heat. She hugged me and I felt her fingers press against my back, against the ridge of my spine, and I felt them slow there the way a reader's finger slows on a word they don't recognize. "You look great, Mom," she said, and the lie was so tender it almost passed for truth. I gave her the tour of nothing. The living room looked the same. I'd made sure of that, kept the pillows arranged, the surfaces dusted. I'd even set a vase of grocery store carnations on the dining table, $1.99 spent like a bribe. She moved through the rooms the way she always did, touching things, opening cabinets to look for a glass, and I trailed behind her, narrating small domestic fictions. I'd been meaning to reorganize the kitchen. I'd been eating out more. I'd discovered I didn't need half the things I used to keep. She opened the refrigerator. The light didn't come on because there was no power running to it. The cord sat coiled on top like a neat, deliberate period at the end of a sentence I hadn't meant to write. Inside, the shelves were bare and dry, wiped clean, and the air that came out wasn't cold, just stale, the particular staleness of a closed space that has forgotten its purpose. Sarah didn't say anything. She stood there with her hand on the door, and I watched the back of her head the way you watch a jury foreman stand up. She closed it gently, almost reverently, and turned to me, and her eyes were wet, but her voice hadn't broken yet. "Mum, I unplugged it to save on the electric," I said. And it came out calm, reasonable, like I was explaining a lifestyle choice I'd read about in a magazine. She walked past me without a word. I followed her down the hallway because I couldn't not follow her, because I already knew where she was going, the way you know the ending of a story once the author shows you the knife in the first act. She went into my bedroom. She went to the nightstand. She opened the drawer. The box of cereal sat there next to my reading glasses and my Bible, and beside it a sleeve of saltines and 3 individually wrapped peppermints I'd taken from the bowl at the bank. Sarah lifted the cereal box, and it was almost empty. I knew because I'd been rationing 3 handfuls a day, and I was close to the dust at the bottom. She turned to me, and the cheerful version of herself she'd assembled in the car was completely gone now, replaced by something raw and ancient, the face of a daughter seeing her mother's hunger laid out like evidence. "Mum." That was all she said at first. Just the word, hanging there between us like a rope thrown across a canyon, and I could see her deciding whether to pull or let go. Her chin did that thing it had done since she was 5 years old, that sideways tremor she could never quite control when the tears were building pressure behind her eyes. I wanted to explain. I had a whole architecture of excuses ready. The kind I'd been constructing for months, the way you'd build a lean-to in a storm. Functional, ugly, temporary. The furnace needed a part. Groceries had gotten so expensive you wouldn't believe what they wanted for a gallon of milk now. I was trying a new diet, something I'd read about in a magazine at the dentist. But Sarah set the cereal box on the bed like she was placing a piece of evidence on a courtroom table, and every excuse I'd built collapsed under the weight of that near-empty box. "I'm managing," I said, because that word had become my cathedral. I'd worshipped there for months, kneeling before it, reciting it like liturgy, managing, as if dignity could be measured by how quietly a person starved. Sarah crossed the room to the kitchen. I heard her opening cabinets, every one of them methodically, the way she used to search the house for hidden Christmas presents. Each hollow thud of a bare shelf was its own small confession. She came back and stood in the doorway, and I watched her eyes move to the unplugged refrigerator with its cord coiled neatly on top like a period at the end of a sentence I'd written months ago. "The seal was going bad on it," I offered. "It was running all the time, driving the bill up. So you just stopped?" Her voice was careful, the way you'd handle something made of old glass. "You just stopped eating real food." I looked down at my hands in my lap. They were thinner than I remembered. The wedding ring Richard had given me 38 years ago could spin freely now, a loose orbit around a shrinking planet. I tucked my thumb over it, an old reflex, keeping it from sliding off. Sarah sat beside me on the bed. The mattress dipped, and I leaned toward her without meaning to, the way a plant bends toward whatever light finds it. She didn't say anything for a long time. The house ticked around us, that particular silence of a home with most of its systems shut down, holding its breath. Then her hand closed around mine, and for the first time in months I felt the warmth of another person's skin. Her fingers found the loose ring and held it in place, held everything in place, and she leaned close to my ear. "Mom, how long have you been choosing between the electric bill and food?" I couldn't answer because the honest number would have broken her. Karen slid a printed document across the kitchen table, typed, numbered, 7 clauses long, and the word contract sat at the top in bold letters like a headstone inscription. I remember the way the paper caught the overhead light, how it seemed to glow against the dark granite countertop like something radioactive. My reading glasses were in my purse by the door, but I didn't need them. The font was large, deliberate, the kind of sizing you'd use for someone you assumed was slow, or old, or both. Karen had even included a signature line at the bottom with my full name pre-typed beneath it, as though my agreement were already a foregone conclusion, a formality no more significant than initialing a grocery receipt. She stood across from me with her arms folded, one hip pressed against the kitchen island, wearing that particular expression I'd come to know so well over the past 3 years, the tight, performative patience of someone who believed she was being extraordinarily generous and wanted the whole room to witness it. Richard sat at the far end of the table with his coffee, scrolling through his phone. Tommy was somewhere upstairs. I could hear the faint percussion of his cartoon through the ceiling, those silly little sound effects that always made me smile when I was alone with him. That morning, they sounded impossibly far away. "I've been thinking about how to make this arrangement work for everyone," Karen said, her voice carrying that boardroom cadence she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "Structure benefits all of us, especially Tommy. Children thrive with clear expectations." I pulled the document closer. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Clause 1 outlined a revised childcare compensation schedule, Her words, not mine, which now required me to pay $400 a month for what she called the privilege of structured grandparent access. 400, up from the 250 she'd imposed 6 months earlier when she'd first decided that my time with my own grandson needed a price tag. I'd paid it. God help me, I'd paid every cent of it without a word, because the alternative was not seeing Tommy at all, and that arithmetic had seemed simple enough at the time. Clause 2 stipulated approved hours. Tuesdays and Thursdays only, 9 to 1, no exceptions. Clause 3 prohibited unapproved food items, which I understood meant the snickerdoodles Tommy and I baked together, the ones he called our secret recipe, even though the only secret was an extra teaspoon of vanilla. Clause 4 restricted religious or ideological discussion, which meant I could no longer read him the stories my own mother had read to me, the ones with morals about kindness and patience and treating people the way you hoped to be treated. I turned the page. My mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. Each clause was a small amputation, clinical and precise, and I could feel something shifting inside my chest, a hairline fracture spreading through whatever scaffolding had held my silence in place all these months. I reached clause 5, and the fracture stopped spreading. It didn't need to spread any further. Clause 5 stated that I would use the garage side door for all arrivals and departures to avoid disrupting the household aesthetic. I read it twice, not because the words were complicated, but because some sentences need a second pass before your body understands what your eyes already know. The household aesthetic, as though I were a delivery that might lower the property value if the neighbors saw it come through the front. I looked up from the paper. Karen sat across from me with her hands laced together on the table, her posture that of someone chairing a quarterly review, calm, prepared, already 2 steps past the outcome she decided on before the meeting began. She wore a silk blouse the color of wet slate, and her wedding ring caught the overhead light every time she shifted her fingers. It was a beautiful ring. Richard had asked me to help pick it out 9 years ago, back when Karen still laughed at my jokes and called me Mum, without the slight pause she'd since inserted before the word. That tiny breath of distance she thought I didn't notice. I turned to Richard. My son, the boy who'd once fallen asleep on my lap during thunderstorms because he said my heartbeat was louder than the rain. He was sitting at the end of the table with one ankle crossed over his knee, and when my eyes found his, he adjusted his glasses, a gesture I'd watched him perform 10,000 times since childhood. The small fidget that meant he was uncomfortable, but had already chosen not to act on it. She's thought of everything, hasn't she? He said. He said it with something that might have been admiration. He said it the way you'd compliment an architect. And the fracture in my chest didn't spread, because there was nothing left to fracture. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. A load-bearing wall simply ceased to exist, and everything it had been supporting rearranged itself in the silence that followed. I looked back down at the contract. Clause 6 required 72 hours advance notice for any visit, submitted in writing. Clause 7 raised my monthly contribution to household expenses, the fee Karen had invented 3 months prior for the privilege of seeing my own grandson, from $200 to $350, with a quarterly adjustment provision tied to, and I am not embellishing this, the Consumer Price Index. She had footnotes. She had footnotes for the footnotes. Somewhere in the margin, she'd penciled a small asterisk beside clause 5, with the annotation asterisk includes holidays asterisk. The kitchen smelled like the lemon verbena candle Karen kept on the windowsill, and through the wall I could hear Tommy talking to himself in his room, narrating some invented world where things still made sense to him. I listened to his voice, muffled, bright, completely unaware, and something in me that had been bending for months finally remembered what it felt like to stand up straight. Karen uncapped a pen and set it on top of the document, centered, deliberate, the way you'd place a mint on a hotel pillow. "Take your time," she said, "but I do need it signed before you see him today." I picked up the pen, felt its weight, heavier than it should have been, the way everything Karen touched seemed to acquire some borrowed gravity. I turned it between my fingers the way I used to turn my wedding ring in the years after Harold died. A slow rotation that bought me time to choose my words before I spent them. Karen watched my hands. She had that look, the one she wore when a negotiation was already settled in her mind and all that remained was the other person catching up to the obvious. I'd seen it at Thanksgiving when she rearranged the seating chart. I'd seen it when she converted the guest room into her home office 3 weeks after Richard and I agreed I could stay in it whenever the drive home was too much. She collected small victories the way some people collect stamps, pressing each one flat under glass where she could admire it. I read clause 5 again. Enter and exit through the garage side door. To avoid disrupting the household aesthetic. There was that word, aesthetic, doing so much quiet violence in a single sentence. It meant I was unsightly. It meant my presence in the front hall, where the neighbors might see me arrive like a person who belonged, was a blemish on the life she had built around my son, like a wall around a garden she hadn't planted. I looked at Richard. He sat at the far end of the table with his coffee mug held in both hands, a man choosing warmth over conscience. I waited for something. A flinch, a clearing of the throat, some involuntary signal that the boy who'd once cried when I dropped him off at summer camp still existed somewhere behind those carefully adjusted glasses. He took a sip, set the mug down, said nothing, and that silence, not Karen's clauses, not the typed demands, not the raised fee or the restricted hours, that silence was what broke the last hinge holding me open for them. Because cruelty from a stranger is weather, you endure it, but cruelty underwritten by your own child's silence is an eviction from a home you built with your body. Something shifted in my chest, not a crack, the opposite of a crack, something fusing shut the way a bone heals thicker at the break. I felt my shoulders settle into a position I hadn't occupied in months, maybe years, squared, level, the posture of a woman who remembered that patience and surrender were not the same word, no matter how often the world used them interchangeably. I folded the contract once, then again, the creases sharp and deliberate, and I slid it into my purse like a keepsake, like evidence. Karen's eyebrows lifted a fraction. She pushed the pen closer. "Do you need a pen?" I snapped my purse shut. "No, I need a lawyer." The printer in the public library spit out Richard's bank statements at 11 cents a page, and every single sheet was worth more than 34 years of my silence. I fed the coins one at a time, dimes and pennies I'd collected from the console of my own car. the one Richard told people he'd bought me, but which I'd paid for with substitute teaching money back in 2011. The machine hummed and churned and delivered each page warm into the tray, and I took them like communion wafers, with both hands, with reverence, with the full understanding that what I held could either save me or destroy everything I had left. The Millbrook Public Library smelled the way it always had. Old carpet and lemon cleaner and the particular stillness of a place where people go to be invisible. I'd chosen a terminal in the back corner, near the large print romance novels nobody browsed on a Wednesday morning. The fluorescent light above me flickered every 40 seconds. I counted. Counting had become a kind of prayer by then, a way to keep my hands from shaking and my thoughts from scattering like starlings off a wire. 6 months of statements. I'd accessed the account online using the password Richard never thought to change because he never thought of me as someone who paid attention. Sarah T0M on my 2003, our grandchildren's names and the year they were born. He'd used it for everything since the day he first touched a computer. It hadn't occurred to him even once that a woman who'd balanced the household checkbook for 3 decades might understand how a bank login worked. The numbers told a story more honest than any Richard had offered me in years. Withdrawals of 400 here, 600 there, all from our joint savings. Small enough to stay beneath my daily notice, frequent enough to bleed us dry. Transfers to an account I didn't recognize but could guess at. Karen's almost certainly funneling money toward whatever version of the future the two of them had been building behind my back. I'd watched my balance dwindle for months and blamed my own forgetfulness, my own aging. The quiet erosion of certainty that comes when the people closest to you insist you're confused often enough that you start believing them. Not anymore. I stacked the pages and aligned their edges against the table the way I used to square fabric before cutting a pattern. Precise, deliberate. My sewing bag sat on the chair beside me, its quilted sides sagging with the weight of the notebook I'd started keeping. Dates, times, things Richard said, things Karen whispered when she thought I was napping in the next room. I'd stitched a false lining into that bag 20 years ago to hide birthday presents from the children. Funny the way small domestic habits could find new purpose. I still had Richard's phone to deal with. He'd left it on the kitchen counter that morning, unlocked, while he went out to meet Karen for coffee. Their Wednesday ritual they thought I didn't know about. I'd photographed everything before driving here. The bank statements told their own story. Neat columns of numbers that mapped Richard's quiet theft like a trail of crumbs leading away from my kitchen table. Withdrawals from the joint account I'd barely touched since Harold died. 2,000 here, 1,500 there, always in amounts just under whatever threshold might trigger a notice. He'd been careful, he'd been patient. He'd learned that from me, I suppose, though he'd twisted the lesson into something I never would have recognized. I sat at the library's corner desk, the one tucked behind the genealogy section where nobody ever wandered, and I spread the printed pages across the table like a hand of cards I was finally ready to play. 6 months of transactions. Money had flowed steadily into an account I'd never seen. One that bore only Richard's name, despite being funded entirely by my late husband's pension. But the bank statements weren't what changed everything. The bank statements were arithmetic, and arithmetic I could stomach. It was the second thread of text messages that broke something loose inside my chest. Not my heart, not exactly, but whatever thin membrane had still been protecting the part of me that wanted to believe my son was merely greedy, not cruel. I'd almost missed it. The conversation with Karen sat right there in Richard's messages, the familiar back and forth about schedules and complaints about me that I'd already photographed. but my thumb had grazed a name I didn't recognize, a David Hensley, Esquire, and the thread beneath it opened like a wound. Richard had written to this attorney 6 weeks before I found any of this. 6 weeks. He'd asked about the process for establishing legal guardianship over an elderly parent, specifically regarding property and financial assets. He'd used words like asterisk, cognitive decline asterisk, and asterisk inability to manage affairs independently asterisk. He'd mentioned the house, my house, the one Harold and I had paid off together the year Tommy learned to ride a bicycle, and described it as asterisk the primary asset in question asterisk. And Karen. Karen had replied in a separate message chain Richard had forwarded to the lawyer as supporting evidence. She'd written 3 detailed paragraphs about my supposed confusion, my alleged forgetfulness, incidents she'd fabricated from whole cloth. She described me leaving the stove on, which had never happened. She described me getting lost driving to the grocery store, which was a lie so brazen it made my hands shake against the library table. She'd even noted, in the careful language of someone rehearsing for a courtroom, that she had asterisk serious concerns about Margaret's capacity to live independently asterisk. They weren't just taking my money, they were building a cage. I read every message twice, then a 3rd time, because I needed the shaking in my hands to stop before I could photograph the screens clearly. The library hummed its quiet, fluorescent hum around me, indifferent to the fact that my son and his wife had been drafting my erasure like a business proposal. I took the photographs anyway. 17 screenshots, each one steady, each one damning, because I had learned something about myself in that fluorescent quiet. My hands could shake and my fingers could still be precise. 34 years of threading needles had given me that at least. The bank statements I'd already printed sat in a neat stack beside the keyboard. 6 months of withdrawals I hadn't authorized. Transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. A recurring payment to a storage unit in Dayton that I was fairly certain held the furniture Richard had told me he'd donated to Goodwill after his father passed. Furniture that had been mine, bought with money I'd earned pressing shirts at the dry cleaners before my knees gave out. Every sheet told the same story, and the story was arithmetic. Cold, clean arithmetic that didn't care about blood or holidays or the baby pictures I still kept in frames on the mantel. I organized the pages by date. I paper-clipped the screenshots to their corresponding statements. I noted in my own handwriting on a yellow legal pad the timeline of every conversation between Richard and Karen about my competency, because a timeline was what an attorney would want, and I had already found the attorney. Her name was Diana Wellston. I'd found her the way I found most things worth finding, by sitting still and paying attention. A pamphlet in the senior centre lobby, tucked between a flyer for chair yoga and a coupon for hearing aid batteries. Elder law, financial exploitation, guardianship disputes. I'd called her office from the library payphone 2 days earlier, and she'd listened to me for 41 minutes without once suggesting I was confused. She'd used words like fiduciary duty and undue influence and conversion of assets, and every single one of them had landed in my chest like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. She told me to bring everything. Every statement, every message, every scrap of paper with Richard's handwriting on it. She told me to tell no one. She told me that what Richard and Karen were attempting, the competency filing, the deed transfer, the slow financial bleeding, had a name, and the name was a crime, and the state of Ohio took it seriously even when families did not. I closed the browser. I cleared the search history the way the librarian had shown me. I gathered every page, every photograph, every note, and I slid the folder into the quilted lining of my old sewing bag where the zipper had broken years ago and created a pocket no one would think to check. The bag Richard always said made me look like somebody's grandmother. Good. Let him keep underestimating the grandmother. The grandmother had just found herself an attorney who didn't. The invitation was a dinosaur theme. Green cardstock, little T-Rex wearing a party hat, and I found it in my own recycling bin, torn cleanly in half. I stood at the counter with both pieces pressed together, the serrated edge where someone had ripped through the word Saturday, running like a fault line across Tommy's careful handwriting. He'd written my name himself. I could tell because the M in Margaret leaned too far to the left, the way all his capital letters did, and because he'd drawn a small heart after the exclamation point that no adult would have thought to add. Someone had taken this from my mailbox, walked it through my kitchen while I was out getting groceries, and fed it to the recycling like a piece of junk mail. I knew whose hands had done it, the same way I knew whose idea it had been. Richard hadn't spoken to me in 11 days, not since the argument about the house, the one where Karen stood behind him in my own living room and whispered prompts like a stage director feeding lines to an understudy. He'd said things that night I'd spent 6 decades never expecting to hear from a child I'd raised. Words designed less to wound than to reclassify me, to move me from the category of mother into something inconvenient, something to be managed and eventually discarded. But the invitation, that was different. That was Tommy. I sat down at the kitchen table with both halves still pinched between my fingers and tried to understand the particular cruelty of it. They hadn't simply not invited me. They'd let Tommy write my name, draw his little heart, seal it in an envelope I found later in the trash with a dinosaur sticker on the flap. They'd let him do all of that and then erased it. I wondered if he'd asked about me. I wondered if he'd stood at the front door during the party watching the driveway for my car. And I had to set the pieces down because my hands were shaking and I was afraid I'd damage them further. It was a Saturday in October. I remember that because the light coming through my kitchen window had that thin, apologetic quality it gets in autumn, when the sun seems to know it's already leaving. I'd bought Tommy's gift 3 weeks earlier, a set of paleontology tools for children, real brushes and a small pick and a plaster block with replica bones embedded inside. It sat wrapped on my hallway table in blue paper covered with smiling triceratops. I'd been so careful with the wrapping. I'd watched a tutorial online to get the corners right. The house was quiet in the way only an empty house can be quiet. The refrigerator humming its low idiot hum, the clock above the stove ticking off seconds that didn't belong to anyone. I poured myself a glass of water and didn't drink it. I lined up the 2 halves of the invitation on the table and smoothed them flat with my palm. And I waited, because I didn't know what else to do, and because some part of me, the part that still believed my son was reachable, kept expecting the phone to ring. The phone did ring. It rang at 4:17 in the afternoon, which meant the party had started at 2, which meant they'd already done the songs and the candles and the opening of gifts. And I knew all of this because I'd been counting the hours like a woman watching weather move across a field, helpless and fixed in place. The number was Richard's home line. I picked up before the second ring finished, and what I heard first wasn't a voice but a sound, the hollow, tiled echo of a small room, a faucet dripping somewhere close to the receiver, and then breathing that was too quick and too shallow to belong to anyone but a child trying very hard to be brave. "Grandma," Tommy whispered. "Grandma, are you there?" I pressed the phone so hard against my ear that the cartilage ached. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. I saved you cake. His voice was barely a thread, stretched tight over something enormous. It's the corner piece with the most frosting, because you said that's the best part, remember? I put it in the freezer behind the ice cream so nobody would find it. My hand was shaking. I steadied it against the edge of the table, against the torn halves of that green cardstock dinosaur. And I said, "That was so thoughtful, Tommy. That was the kindest thing." "Why didn't you come?" he asked. And the thread broke. He was crying, not the loud performative crying of a child who wants attention, but the muffled, swallowed kind, the kind where a 6-year-old has locked himself in a bathroom during his own birthday party because the grief is too big for the room full of people who are supposed to love him. "Daddy said you were busy, but I don't think you were busy. Were you busy, Grandma?" I opened my mouth and the truth sat on my tongue like a stone. I couldn't give it to him. I couldn't lie to him either. So I said I wanted to be there more than anything in the whole world, and that at least was something he could hold. "Mhon, bring you the cake," he whispered. "I'll bring it next time I—" "Tommy!" The voice cut through like a door slamming in a cathedral. Karen, clear, close, unhurried. She'd been on the line the entire time, listening to every fractured syllable my grandson had offered me in secret. "Tommy, hang up the phone." "But Grandma doesn't want to come, baby. We talked about this. Hang up the phone and come back to your party." I heard him inhale one ragged, terrible breath, and then the click of a receiver being set down by small, obedient hands. Karen stayed on the line. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence was the message, delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she'd just done and wanted me to understand it too. The line went dead. I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing, and something inside me that had been bending for months finally stopped bending. It didn't snap. That's what people get wrong about moments like these. They imagine some dramatic fracture, some Hollywood shattering of glass. But what happened inside my chest was quieter than that, and infinitely worse. It simply stopped giving. The part of me that had spent 62 years accommodating, forgiving, finding the generous interpretation, it went still, the way a lake goes still before the temperature drops low enough to freeze it solid. I set the phone on the kitchen table and stared at it like it was something that had bitten me. Tommy had whispered so carefully. He'd cupped his hand around the receiver. I could tell from the muffled quality of his voice the way consonants softened against his small palm. He'd planned it. A 6-year-old had snuck away from his own birthday party, locked himself in a bathroom, and called me to say he'd hidden a piece of cake in the freezer behind the frozen peas so nobody would find it. Dinosaur cake. Green frosting. He described it to me like he was describing buried treasure, his voice vibrating with the particular pride of a child who believes he has outsmarted the adults. And Karen had been listening the entire time. She'd let him talk. She'd let him describe the cake and tell me he missed me and ask why I wasn't there. She'd let him say, "I love you, Grandma," in that bathroom whisper. She let all of it unspool, every word of it, because she wanted me to hear what I was missing. And then she stepped in and told my grandson that I didn't want to come. Not that I wasn't invited, not that there'd been a scheduling conflict, that I didn't want to. I pressed my fingertips against the torn invitation that still sat on my counter. The two halves lined up like I could heal them. The little T-Rex in his party hat grinned up at me from the green cardstock, oblivious. Richard's handwriting was on the back. He'd written the address himself, our old family shorthand, just the street number and a smiley face, because of course I knew where my own son lived. He'd written it, and then someone had torn it in half and buried it in my recycling bin during their last visit, placed it deep beneath the newspapers, so I'd find it too late, or never. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected trembling, tears, some bodily evidence of what was happening. But my hands were perfectly still as I opened my laptop on the kitchen table, right next to the dead phone, and typed slowly into the search bar, "not custody." I wasn't naive enough to think any court would hand me that. I typed the filing requirements for a restraining order in the state of Virginia, and the respondent I had in mind was my own son. The kitchen table still had Richard's coffee ring on it, a brown ghost of a mug he'd lifted for the last time 3 days ago, and I set my pen right inside that circle like I was signing a contract with everything he'd left behind. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycling, that low mechanical hum I'd spent 37 years tuning out the way you tune out a marriage. The clock above the stove read 11:14 at night. I had a glass of water I wasn't drinking, a box of tissues I was trying not to need, and a shoebox on the chair beside me that weighed more than any object made of paper had a right to weigh. I'd been carrying that shoebox from apartment to apartment, house to house, closet shelf to closet shelf, for over a decade. Every time Richard handed someone a check I couldn't afford, every time I drove to a Western Union or wrote a money order at the gas station counter, I'd kept the receipt. Not because I was building a case, not because I was smart enough to see where all of this was heading. I kept them because some quiet, stubborn corner of me needed proof that I existed in these transactions, that my hands had done the giving, even when my name never made it into anyone's thank you. I pulled the lid off, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, old ink, the faintly chemical scent of thermal receipts already fading toward blank. Some of them I'd stapled to notebook pages where I'd written the date and the reason. Karen's electric bill, February. Tommy's car insurance, 2 months. Sarah's wisdom teeth, our share. Asterisk others were just loose slips curling at the edges, the amounts still legible if I tilted them toward the overhead light. I started sorting them by year: 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, all the way forward to last month, which was a cash withdrawal of $400 that Richard had tucked into a greeting card for Karen's birthday like it was nothing, like money just materialized in our account, the way weather materialized in the sky. Nothing to do with anyone's labor. My hands shook as I laid them out, not from anger, or not only from anger, from the strange gut-level terror of making visible what I had worked so hard to absorb in silence. Each receipt was a small wound I'd swallowed whole, and now I was coughing them all up onto the kitchen table, and the table wasn't big enough. I had to start overlapping them, year on top of year, a mosaic of my own disappearance. The letter itself, I hadn't written a word of it yet. The pen sat inside Richard's coffee ring like a compass needle that had lost north. I knew what I wanted to say. I'd been composing it in my head for years, probably, assembling sentences while I loaded the dishwasher or drove home from the second job Richard never acknowledged I'd taken. But knowing what to say and finding the nerve to say it was separated by a distance I hadn't fully measured until I sat down and felt the width of it in my chest. I started with the oldest receipt. November 2014. $400 to the mechanic who'd rebuilt Karen's transmission after she'd driven it dry of oil for 6 months. I remembered that one because it had been the week before Thanksgiving, and I'd served a turkey breast instead of a whole bird to cover the difference, and Richard had complained about it at the table like I'd insulted his bloodline. I wrote the date, the amount, the purpose. I moved to the next one. January 2015. $600 for Karen's back rent when she'd lost the hostessing job she'd held for 11 days. March 2015. $250 for the pediatric dentist Tommy's kids needed because his insurance had lapsed again. My handwriting steadied with each entry. There was something medicinal about precision, about letting the numbers carry the weight so my voice didn't have to crack under it. I wasn't writing an accusation. I was assembling a skeleton, bone by bone, and anyone who read it would recognize the shape of the body without me having to name what had died. By the time I reached 2019, the receipts covered half the table and my tea had gone cold in the cup. I organized them in rows at first, neat little columns sorted by year, but there were too many. I had to start overlapping them, year on top of year, a mosaic of my own disappearance. Then I found the one from August 2020. I almost missed it. It had been stapled to a bank statement and folded into the back of a manila folder I had labeled Karen, Housing. And when I unfolded it, I saw the landlord's name, the property address, and the amount. $600. I remembered writing that check on the bathroom counter because Richard had been in the kitchen and I hadn't wanted to explain it. Karen had called me sobbing at 11 at night, saying she'd be out on the street by Friday, and I had driven the check over before dawn and slid it under the landlord's office door myself. But stapled behind the receipt was a screenshot I'd printed months later and forgotten about. A Facebook post. Karen's Facebook post, public for everyone to see, dated 3 days after I delivered that check. Asterisk. So thankful for my amazing father who stepped in when no one else would. Dad, you saved me and the kids. I don't know where I'd be without you. 47 comments underneath. Hearts. Crying emojis. Richard had replied with a single red heart, and he'd never corrected her, not once. I read it again, then a third time. My hands didn't shake. Something far past trembling had taken hold, a stillness that felt geological, like a fault line locking into place the instant before it moves. She hadn't just failed to thank me, she had taken the help I gave her in secret and dressed it in his name and paraded it in front of everyone we knew. She had made him the hero of a rescue he'd slept through. I picked up the pen. The width in my chest collapsed to a single bright point, and the words came like they'd been held underwater and were finally allowed to breathe. I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. I wrote about the $7,000 that went to Karen's rehab, the checks I'd signed in the bathroom with the fan running so Richard wouldn't hear the pen. I wrote about the Christmas I paid Tommy's electric bill and Richard took credit at dinner, raising his glass like some patron saint of generosity while I cut the turkey with hands still cramped from addressing the envelope. I wrote about the grocery runs and the medical co-pays and the late-night phone calls where I talked Sarah through her panic attacks while Richard snored in the next room, dreaming whatever empty men dream about when they've convinced the world they carry weight. The receipts fanned out across the table in front of me, arranged by date. 14 months of evidence laid end to end like vertebrae, and for the first time I could see the full spine of what I'd done, and the full spine of what had been done to me in return. Each one had a story. The carbon copy from February that still smelled faintly of the Dollar General counter where I'd bought the money order. The bank statement from July with my handwriting in the margin. Karen's rent, do not mention asterisk, as though I'd been coaching myself on my own erasure. My tears hit the paper and the ink bled in small blue flowers. I didn't blot them. I wanted my children to see what truth looked like when it left the body. I wanted the words to carry evidence of what they cost. I did not write to wound. That's what I need anyone listening to understand. Every sentence I put down was a fact pinned to a receipt, a date married to a dollar amount, a kindness matched to the silence that swallowed it. I wasn't constructing a weapon. I was dismantling a lie that had been furnished and decorated and lived in so comfortably that everyone had forgotten it was a structure at all. The hardest paragraph was the last one. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that once I said it, the version of me that kept the peace, the Margaret who absorbed and forgave and folded other people's chaos into neat squares and stored it in her own chest. That woman would be finished. And I had loved her. I had loved her the way you love something that's kept you alive even as it's made you smaller. I thanked her in my mind. Then I let her go. I signed each letter the same way. Asterisk. With love I should have given myself. Margaret. I sealed the last envelope, one for Sarah, one for Tommy, one for Karen, and lined them on the counter like headstones. By morning, every member of my family would know exactly who had been keeping them alive, and exactly who had been killing me to do it, and there would be no version of this story left for anyone to hide inside. Richard's hands were shaking so badly that the letter rattled against the kitchen table like something alive. And when he looked up at me, I realized I had never once seen my brother cry in 58 years. Not when Dad died. Not when his first marriage collapsed around him like a house built on sand that finally met the tide. Not even when Tommy was born 6 weeks early and spent his first month in a plastic box threaded with wires. Richard had always worn his composure the way other men wore their Sunday suits, stiff, uncomfortable, but never removed in public. And now that composure lay in pieces around him, scattered across his kitchen like the pages of the letter he'd already read 3 times. I stood near the sink because I didn't trust myself to sit across from him. My legs felt borrowed, unreliable, as though my body had already decided this moment was too much and was preparing to leave without me. The kitchen smelled like the coffee Karen had brewed an hour ago, before anyone arrived, before the world she'd constructed started showing its seams. That smell would stay with me for years. Dark roast and the particular chemical sweetness of her countertop cleaner, the scent of a perfectly maintained lie. Sarah stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from an engine. She hadn't said a word since Richard opened the envelope. She didn't need to. Her jaw was set in that way I recognized from her childhood, the way it locked when she was holding something back. Not tears, but something heavier, something with teeth. I noticed her hand drift toward her coat pocket, then pull away, then drift again. I didn't understand that gesture yet. The rest of them filtered in the way family does during a crisis, not all at once, but in a staggered procession of confusion and dread. Richard had called them. I hadn't asked him to. I hadn't asked for any of this, not really. I had simply stopped carrying the silence, set it down on a page, and let gravity do what gravity does. Karen appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and I watched her read the room the way a general reads a battlefield. Her eyes moved from Richard's face to the letter to me, and I saw the calculation happen in real time, the micro-adjustments behind her expression, the way she assembled her response, like someone loading a weapon. She was still beautiful in that sharp architectural way of hers, every angle deliberate, every surface polished to deflect. Tommy sat at the far end of the table, his broad hands folded in front of him, utterly still. He hadn't read the letter yet. He was watching his mother, and there was something in his stillness that unsettled me more than Richard's tears, a patience that didn't belong to the gentle boy I'd known, a patience that felt like a door being held shut against something enormous. Karen opened her mouth, and the room stopped breathing. "This is pathetic," she said, and her voice came out clean and controlled, every syllable placed like a tile in a mosaic she'd been laying for decades. "Margaret wrote that letter herself. She's been jealous of this family since the day Richard married me, and now she's finally found a way to poison all of you against me." She turned to Richard, and I watched her reach for his arm, a gesture so practiced it had the quality of choreography. "Honey, you know her. You know what she's capable of. She's been alone her whole life, and she can't stand that we have something she never will. I felt the words land in my chest like stones dropped into still water. Not because they hurt. I'd long since stopped letting Karen's teeth find purchase in my skin, but because for one terrible tilting second, I saw Richard's eyes shift. I saw the old machinery engage, the gears of a marriage built on the path of least resistance, and I understood that he wanted to believe her. Believing her was the architecture of his entire adult life. Disbelieving her meant the house came down. The room wavered. Sarah's husband looked at the floor. Richard's hand moved toward Karen's, and I felt the whole fragile scaffolding of truth begin to buckle under the weight of a woman who had spent 30 years making reality bend around her convenience. Then Sarah stood up. She didn't announce herself. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lifted her phone from the table, tapped the screen 3 times with a thumb that trembled only slightly, and set it down between us like a lit match on dry wood. Karen's voice filled the kitchen, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakable. That clipped cadence, that particular way she bit down on consonants. The voicemail was from March, left on a night Karen apparently assumed Sarah would delete it the way she deleted everything inconvenient. In it, Karen described exactly what she'd done with the trust paperwork. She laughed about how easy Richard was to manage. She called me a word I will not repeat, and then she said, with the casual cruelty of someone pulling a weed, that Margaret would never have the nerve to say anything because Margaret had always been too afraid of losing Richard to fight for him. The recording lasted 41 seconds. I know because I watched the timer on the screen, counting each one the way you count the distance of a thunderstorm. When it ended, the silence that followed had texture. It was thick and granular, like silt settling after a flood. Richard pulled his hand away from Karen's. The motion was small, just a few inches of withdrawal across a kitchen table, but it contained the weight of every year he had chosen not to see. Karen's face didn't crumble. It rearranged. The mask didn't fall so much as it shifted into something new, a configuration I'd never seen, all the practiced warmth stripped away to reveal the cold engineering beneath. She pushed her chair back, and the scrape of wood against tile sounded like a bone breaking. She reached for her coat on the hook by the door, and the motion was so fluid, so rehearsed, that I understood she had always kept an exit strategy folded into the lining of every room she entered. Her keys were already in her hand. I hadn't even seen her pick them up. "You people," she said, and the word people landed like she was addressing strangers at a bus stop. "You ungrateful, delusional people." Richard made a sound, not a word, something older than language, something that lived in the part of the throat where grief and rage share a wall. He was staring at the letters spread across the table, his fingers hovering just above the ink as though it might burn him again if he touched it. I watched him mouth a line from the second page, the part about the savings account, the one he'd set up for Sarah's college fund that had quietly emptied itself over 3 years, and his lips moved without sound, like a man trying to pray in a language he'd forgotten. "Karen." His voice came out scraped raw. "The Hollowell account. You told me the bank restructured it." She didn't answer him. She was pulling on her coat, one arm and then the other, buttoning it with fingers that moved at a pace so deliberate it bordered on theatrical. She was performing composure for an audience she believed she still controlled. "You told me the bank restructured it," he said again, louder now, and the repetition had the quality of a man pressing on a bruise just to confirm the pain was real. Sarah stood motionless by the counter, her phone still open in her hand, the voicemail silence louder than its playback had been. She was watching her father with an expression I recognized from my own mirror, the particular grief of seeing someone you love understand something too late. Richard's chair screamed against the floor as he stood. His hands found the edge of the table and gripped it, knuckles white, as though the kitchen might spin off its axis if he let go. Tears were moving down his face in 2 unbroken lines, and he didn't wipe them. I don't think he knew they were there. 31 years, he whispered. 31 years, and I defended you to my own sister. He looked at me then, and the apology in his eyes was so enormous, so unwieldy, that neither of us could hold it. I looked away, not because I didn't forgive him. I would, eventually, in the slow and imperfect way that real forgiveness works, but because some things need to be set down before they can be carried. Karen grabbed her keys and walked toward the door. And Tommy, quiet, gentle Tommy, who had never raised his voice at anyone, stepped into the doorframe and said, "Sit down, Mom," in a tone that made every person in that room stop breathing. Sarah's car pulled into my driveway at 9:10 on a Saturday morning, and for the first time in 11 months, nobody had called ahead to negotiate terms. I stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel twisted between my hands, watching the silver sedan roll to a stop behind my azalea bushes. The engine cut. The morning went still in that particular way early September mornings do in Virginia, where the heat hasn't broken yet, but the light has already started to change, going golden at the edges like a photograph left too long in the sun. I could see Sarah's silhouette behind the windshield, her head turning toward the passenger side, and then the rear door opened and a pair of small sneakers hit my driveway and my chest cracked open like a walnut. Tommy. He'd grown. Even from 30 feet away, through glass that needed cleaning, I could see it. His legs had stretched. His hair was longer, curling at his collar the way Richard's used to before Karen started taking him to that barber on Elm Street. He stood beside the car with one hand on the door, looking at my house the way you look at a place you're not sure will let you in. I set the towel down. I smoothed my blouse. I did not run. I wanted to run. Every ligament in my body wanted to throw open the front door and cross that lawn in bare feet and gather him up and press my face into his hair and breathe him in like oxygen. But I had learned things in those 11 months. I had learned that desperation makes you a commodity. That love, when displayed too hungrily, becomes a thing people can package and sell back to you at whatever markup they choose. So I walked to the door. I opened it at a normal speed. I stepped onto the porch and held the railing because my knees had turned to something unreliable, and I looked at Sarah. She stood by the driver's side now, arms folded loosely, wearing an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't the performative warmth she'd worn to Thanksgiving dinners when she still needed Richard to co-sign her car loan. It was something careful, measured, the face of someone who has rehearsed a moment and is now checking whether it lands the way she'd planned. That should have told me everything. But Tommy was already moving. He'd let go of the car door and taken 2 steps toward the porch, his head tilted slightly, his eyes wide and searching. He looked like a boy who'd been told one thing about a place and was discovering something different. I noticed he was holding a folded piece of paper in his left hand, gripping it the way children grip permission slips they've been told not to lose. "Hi, baby," I said. My voice didn't shake. I considered that a victory. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked back at Sarah once, quick, almost furtive, like he was checking whether this was still allowed. She nodded from the driver's seat, a small wave, and he turned back to me and climbed the steps one at a time, deliberate, like each one required a separate decision. I knelt. I didn't reach for him. I'd learned something about children and doorways. You don't pull them through, you open and you wait. He crossed the last 2 feet between us and pressed his face into my shoulder, and the weight of him, the specific gravity of a 5-year-old boy against my collarbone, undid something I'd spent 11 months cinching tight. My arms came around him and I breathed in the cheap strawberry shampoo Sarah always used, and the faintly sour smell of car upholstery, and beneath all of it the warm bread scent that was just Tommy, that had been Tommy since the hospital nursery when they'd laid him across my chest because Sarah was too exhausted and Richard was in the hallway on his phone. I didn't cry. Not yet. I held that back the way you hold back a cough in a cathedral. Not because the feeling was wrong, but because I didn't want the sound of it to frighten him. I missed you, I said into his hair. He pulled back and looked at me with Richard's eyes in Sarah's face, and his mouth was doing something complicated, working around a thought too large for it. Grandma, he said, Mommy said you didn't want to see me anymore. The morning went very still. A cardinal landed on the porch railing and left again. Somewhere behind me, inside the house, the kitchen faucet dripped its patient rhythm against the stainless steel basin. She said that, I repeated, not a question, a placement. I was setting the words down on a flat surface so I could look at them without dropping anything else. He nodded. The folded paper in his hand crinkled. She said you were too busy and that maybe later you'd feel different. But I wrote you letters. At school. Mrs. Patterson helped me with the spellings. I never got them, baby. I know, he said, and the way he said it, resigned, unsurprised, as though at 5 years old he already understood that messages could be swallowed by the space between people, carved something out of me that I don't think grew back. I looked past him to the car. Sarah was checking her phone, her face lit blue-white by the screen. She glanced up, caught me watching, and smiled. It was the smile she'd given me at the rehearsal dinner, at the baby shower, at every Thanksgiving where she'd needed the good china, and the third bedroom, and my silence about things I shouldn't have been silent about. It was a smile that meant she was building something, and I was a load-bearing wall she'd identified. I smiled back. I'd gotten better at arithmetic since November. I could feel the shape of what this visit cost before I found the receipt. I turned back to Tommy and held his face in both hands. You're my whole sky, I told him. The words came out cracked down the middle, and I didn't care. His cheeks were warm under my palms, still round with the baby fat he'd lose by next year, and I memorized the weight of them because I'd learnt that everything could be revoked without warning. He giggled. He didn't know what the phrase meant. That was fine. I'd say it again when he was old enough to understand, or I'd die having said it, and either outcome sat right with me. We went inside and I made him chocolate chip pancakes the way he liked them. Burnt edges, soft center, too much syrup. Richard would have said I was spoiling him. Karen would have pursed her lips about the sugar. Neither of them was here, and the kitchen belonged to me, and the syrup belonged to Tommy, and I poured until the plate looked like a shallow amber lake. He ate 3, I ate half of one and spent the rest of the time watching him chew with his mouth open, talking about a cartoon dog who solved mysteries, narrating the plot with the kind of breathless authority only a 4-year-old possesses. I laughed so hard my chest ached. The ache stayed after the laughter stopped, settled into the space between my ribs like a tenant who'd paid first and last month's rent. Sarah stayed in the living room most of the morning. She was pleasant. She complimented the new curtains. She asked about my blood pressure medication with what sounded like genuine concern, and every few minutes she'd glance toward the kitchen doorway, checking, not on Tommy, but on me, measuring something. I recognized the look because I'd spent 40 years married to a man who measured rooms before he entered them, calculated what each person in them could do for him. I'd married that arithmetic. I'd raised a son who'd married it too. And now his ex-wife sat on my couch, running numbers I couldn't see. Around noon, she said they had to go. Tommy cried. I didn't, but only because I'd practiced. I walked them to the car, buckled him into his seat myself, kissed his forehead 3 times, one for each month I'd been told I couldn't, and stood in the driveway as they pulled away. His hand waved in the back window until the car turned the corner, and then the street was just a street again. I went back inside slowly. The kitchen smelled like syrup. His napkin was still on the table, crumpled into a shape that almost looked intentional, like a small fist. Then I noticed my purse sitting open on the hallway table, and I knew I hadn't left it that way. I found the document folded once, tucked between my wallet and my glasses case. A custody petition filed in county court dated 4 days ago. My name was on page 6, listed as a character witness against Richard and Karen. Sarah hadn't brought Tommy back. She'd brought an audition. The kitchen table Richard built me for our 30th anniversary had a crack running through its centre now, and I'd stopped pretending I didn't know when it started. November light came through the window above the sink in that thin, apologetic way it always did, like even the sun understood it had less to offer this time of year. I sat with my coffee cooling between my palms and traced the split in the oak with my thumbnail. The crack ran from just left of centre all the way to the far edge, a hairline fracture that had widened slowly, the way most ruinous things do. You could set a plate over it. You could lay a runner of linen across the middle and pretend the surface was whole. I'd done both for longer than I cared to measure. I was 62 years old, and I had learned exactly one thing worth knowing. The price of silence was never silence. It was compound interest on a debt you didn't remember signing, and it came due in rooms you thought were safe. The house was quieter than it had been in the months since the separation. Not empty, I want to be precise about that. Sarah brought Tommy over on Saturdays, and the boy had a way of filling a house with noise that felt like weather, warm and ungovernable. Karen called on Wednesdays, though those calls still carried the stiff formality of 2 people rebuilding a bridge while standing on opposite banks, neither willing to admit who had burned the original. And Richard existed now at a careful distance, like a planet that had slipped its orbit and was still deciding whether to drift into the dark or find a new path around the sun. I hadn't asked him to leave. That was important to me, the accuracy of it. I'd asked him to stop lying, and the geometry of his life made leaving the only honest response. He'd rented a place above the hardware store on Elm, a 1-bedroom with baseboard heating, and a window that looked out on the parking lot of the Baptist church. Sarah told me this. I hadn't asked, but she told me, and I let her, because refusing information about the man I'd shared 41 years with felt like a different kind of dishonesty, the kind I was finished practicing. What I hadn't expected, what I could not have predicted with all my quiet years of observation, was Karen's car pulling into my driveway on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 days before Thanksgiving, with something rectangular pressed against her coat, like she was shielding it from rain that wasn't falling. I watched her through the kitchen window. She sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, hands at 10 and 2, staring at my front door the way a person stares at a lake they're about to wade into without knowing the depth. I knew that look. I had worn it myself the night I'd finally opened my mouth and let 4 decades of swallowed words spill across this very table, right across the crack that was already there, waiting. The doorbell rang, and I didn't move. Not yet. I let her ring it twice before I crossed the hallway. That was something I'd learned in the past year, that rushing to open doors for people who'd spent decades expecting them held wide was its own quiet form of surrender. I opened it on my terms, in my time, and Karen stood on the porch looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, which was strange because she'd always been the kind of woman who filled a room just by deciding it belonged to her. I should have called, she said. You should have, I said, but I stepped aside. She came in smelling like the cold and something floral I didn't recognize, not the perfume she used to wear, the one that lingered on Richard's coat those nights he came home late from helping her with the gutters. She sat at the kitchen table without being invited, and her fingers found the crack in the wood the way fingers always do, tracing it like a question. I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The silence between us was different from the old silence, the one that had stretched across holiday dinners like a tarp thrown over something rotting. This silence had texture. It was two women deciding, breath by breath, whether honesty was worth the mess it made. He's been going to someone, Karen said. A therapist. Since March. I set her mug down harder than I meant to. Richard doesn't believe in therapists. Richard believes in whiskey and changing the subject. He did. She wrapped both hands around the mug but didn't drink. He's been writing letters, one for Sarah, one for Tommy, one for me. She paused, and I watched her throat work. And one for you. She reached into her coat and pulled out the rectangle I'd seen from the window. A cream-coloured envelope, thick, sealed with the kind of deliberateness that meant he'd pressed the flap down and held it there, counting. My name was written on the front in his hand, not the loose scrawl of grocery lists and birthday cards, but careful letters, each one formed like it cost him something. He didn't ask me to bring it, Karen said. I took it from the stack on his counter. Because I read mine, and her voice fractured just slightly along a seam I hadn't known was there. He wrote about what he did to you, what we did. Not excuses, not the version where it just happened, where nobody meant anything by it. The real version, the ugly one. She looked at me then, and her eyes were wet, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a thin, bewildering thread of grief for her too, for the woman she might have been if she hadn't spent 15 years pretending that taking from me was the same as being given. I'm not here to ask forgiveness, she said. I'm here because you deserved to have someone walk it to your door. I picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. I waited until Karen's taillights disappeared down the drive before I opened it. Not because I was afraid of what Richard had written, but because I wanted to be alone with whatever version of him lived inside those pages. I owed myself that much. The quiet, the unwitnessed reading. His handwriting had changed. It had always been sharp, certain, the penmanship of a man who believed he knew exactly where every line should go. Now the letters leaned into each other like they were tired, like they'd been walking a long time and had finally stopped caring how they looked arriving. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He wrote about the morning Tommy was born, how he'd held that boy in the hospital hallway and promised him a house that felt like safety, and how somewhere between that promise and the man he became, he'd confused safety with control, confused silence with shelter. He wrote about Karen, not to excuse it but to name it, the way you'd name a wound so the surgeon could find it. He wrote about Sarah, how she'd stopped calling him Dad on the phone and started calling him Richard, and how that single shift had broken something in him that therapy was only now teaching him had been broken long before. I read the letter twice. The first time I wept, the second time I didn't, and the second time was harder. I folded it along his creases and set it on the cracked table and pressed my palm flat against the wood. 30 years of meals, arguments, homework, holiday mornings. 30 years of a woman sitting in this chair telling herself that endurance was the same as love. It wasn't, I knew that now. Love required voice. It required the terrible courage of saying asterisk, this is not acceptable asterisk, and meaning it even when your own heart begged you to stay quiet, stay small, keep the peace that was never peace at all. The price of silence was never silence. It was everything that grew in the dark while I wasn't looking. I sat there until the kitchen went gold, then amber, then grey. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just sitting in my own house, in my own life, and for the first time in years the stillness felt chosen rather than inherited. When I finally stood to put the kettle on, my knee bumped the table's edge and something slid from underneath, a smaller envelope, wedged between the crossbeam and the tabletop, yellowed at the corners. Not part of the letter Karen brought. Older, hidden there long before today, maybe long before any of this. Richard's handwriting again, but the sharp version, the certain version, addressed to a woman named Elaine Calloway, a date, 14 months before Tommy was born, and beneath the name a single line in pencil, faded nearly to ghost. I'm sorry I never told her. The crack in the table hadn't started when I thought it did.